I'll forever remember the day Kwaku tried to conquer the mountain. It wasn't just any mountain, it was the mountain. It stood on the edge of our village like a quiet giant, its peak always hidden by clouds, as if guarding secrets we were never meant to know. The elders called it Nyame's staircase, an Akan phrase that translates to God's staircase. The elders believed that it was a place no human could conquer, but Kwaku, my best friend, believed otherwise, and so the whole village gathered to watch him try. I was there that day, sitting with the other villagers. Kwaku was my childhood friend, proud, strong, and stubborn. He believed he could overcome anything, and honestly, so did I. But that mountain was different. That morning, Kwaku stood in the center of the village square, his chin high and his voice loud. "Wait here," he declared, tightening the straps on his sandals. "By sundown, you'll see me waving from the top." The villagers murmured among themselves. Some cheered, others shook their heads. I stood nearby, uneasy, but silent. Kwaku had always been bold, but this felt different, foolish even. Elder Kofi, the wisest man in the village, stepped forward. "Kwaku," he said calmly, "Nyame's staircase is not meant to be conquered. It has stood for generations, and no one, no warrior, no hunter, no king, has ever reached its peak." But Kwaku just grinned. "Then I'll be the first." And with that, he turned and started up the trail. We watched as his figure grew smaller, swallowed by the shadows of the mountain. At first, Kwaku's steps were steady and confident. The lower part of the mountain was gentle, with wide trails and soft grass. But as he climbed higher, the path grew narrower, the rocks sharper. The sun blazed overhead and the wind began to howl. Still, Kwaku pressed on, determined to prove everyone wrong. Back in the village, we waited. Hours passed. Some villagers sat on mats, chatting and laughing, confident Kwaku would return triumphant. Others, like me, couldn't hide their worry. I sat with Elder Kofi, who quietly carved a small wooden figure. "Do you think he'll make it?" I asked. Kofi didn't look up. The mountain isn't about making it. It's about learning from it. I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't ask. My eyes stayed fixed on the trail, hoping to see Kwaku's waving hand appear above the trees. Meanwhile, Kwaku's confidence began to crack. The trail had become dangerously steep. Rocks crumbled under his feet, tumbling into the abyss below. His hands were scraped, his clothes torn, and his breath came in heavy gasps. Still, he pushed on. "I can do this," he muttered to himself, gripping a jagged rock for balance. "I have to." The higher he climbed, the fiercer the wind grew. It roared in his ears, pulling at him and threatening to push him back down the mountain. He slipped once, then twice, barely catching himself each time. The peak still seemed impossibly far, hidden behind its eternal veil of clouds. For the first time, doubt crept into Kwaku's mind. By late afternoon, Kwaku reached a narrow ledge. Below him, the village looked like a cluster of tiny dots. Above him, the peak remained distant, almost taunting. He sat on the ledge, exhausted. His legs ached, his hands bled, and his pride felt heavier than the mountain itself. He stared at the peak, willing it to come closer, but it didn't. happened. He looked at me, then at the crowd, small smile playing on his lips. "I learned something today," he said. "Some things aren't meant to be conquered. They're meant to teach us." Elder Kofi stepped forward, his eyes twinkling. "And what did it teach you?" Kwaku paused, looking at the mountain behind him. "Acceptance," he said simply. "I couldn't force the mountain to bend to me, but I could respect it and myself for knowing when to stop." The lesson. That night, as we sat around the fire, Kwaku's words echoed in my mind. The mountain had always been there, silent and unchanging. But for the first time, I saw it differently. It wasn't a challenge to conquer. It was a teacher, offering lessons to those willing to listen. Kwaku changed that day, and so did I. He taught us all that strength isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about knowing when to step back, accept, and grow. Even now, years later, I think about that mountain. Its peak remains shrouded in clouds, unconquered. But its lesson, that lives on in all of us.